Welcome to today's MESUD Learning Community PMP webinar. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Delvina Miremadi-Baldino on fostering positive bonds, supporting youth and families affected by AUD through positive childhood experiences and positive psychology. My name is Bethany with CCSME and I'll be supporting today's webinar. Just a few quick notes before I begin. First, neither the presenters nor the planners have any relevant financial relationships to disclose. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with accreditation requirements and policies of the ACCME through a joint providership of the Hanley Center for Health, Leadership, and Education and CCSME. The Hanley Center is accredited by the MMA Committee on Continuing Medical Education and Accreditation to provide CME for physicians. The Hanley Center has designated this activity for one AMA PRA Category 1 credit. The opinions expressed by the speaker of this PMP webinar series are their own and do not represent the positions of the state of Maine or CCSME. Recording and live stream transmission of this webinar without consent is not permitted. We'll have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers, so please hold all questions until that time, and you can place them in the chat feature in Zoom. And now I'd like to give a quick introduction to our speaker today. Dr. Miremadi-Baldino has dedicated her career to the intersection of education, psychology, and resilience. Her previous expertise as MRBN's deputy director and nearly 20-year history of working across education, healthcare, for-profit, and nonprofit sectors have distinguished her as a recognized leader and behavioral health change agent. She brings the unique skills of translating research, program development, and a deep understanding of how to weave health equity into the fabric of Maine, empowering every individual, family, and community to flourish. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Miremadi-Baldino for our presentation. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Bethany. Welcome, everyone. Thrilled to spend this lunch hour with you and look forward to sharing more of the work of Maine Youth Thriving, specific to kind of thinking about the protective nature of youth thriving, connection, and what fostering bonds can do when we're thinking about supporting the well-being of, really across the lifespan in that prevention of AUD or SUD. So Maine Youth Thriving, just a little bit about us. We were known as the Maine Resilience Building Network until about August of this year. So we've gone through a rebrand and really just realigning the work that we're doing now with our outward messaging and our brand. And so I look forward to really supporting your work and answering any questions you have as we look at what youth need in order to thrive. So specifically today, we'll talk about the impact of experience, how positive childhood experiences can cultivate or help foster youth thriving, and in doing so, really protect and buffer the impact of ACEs that lead to a lot of these negative health outcomes. We'll also look specifically at some strategies that will help to build relationships that we know support well-being, and many of these come from the science of flourishing, which is the positive psychology field. And so we'll kind of get to explore some of those specific strategies within a framework today, and hopefully have you walk away feeling a little more competent, confident, and compassionate, both towards yourselves and those that you're working with, and of course, more hopeful. The foundation of the work that we do here is really grounded in this idea that experiences matter. We know that we now understand with neuroplasticity that genes may set the stage, but it's really the experiences that we have across our lifespan, as well as in some of these more critical developmental ages, where that really make the difference and create, the person that we're going to be, how we're able to navigate challenges, the choices we make, whether it's risky or not, and also our adult physical and mental health. So as you can see, right, these experiences are really important. And so being really thoughtful and intentional about the environments, the relationships, and the experiences that we have and that we are creating for youth are going to ultimately impact their use of substances and a variety of other health factors. So we all know now, right, the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that came out in 1998, was looking at, adults and having them reflect on their childhood. How many, right, of these adverse childhood experiences did they have? And then they correlated it with their adult mental and physical health. What the ACEs study didn't consider were, now in more recent years, understanding a variety of adversities that can impact our well-being. And that being this research coming at Dr. Wendy Ellis and looking at what she calls the pair of ACEs. So also considering that there are adverse community environments that were not considered in that original study that contribute to adversity, right? All of these experiences, as we know, are going to disrupt healthy brain development and lead to disruptions in the nervous system that then impact how one shows up in the world, how one navigates challenges. And that's really what this research showed. So one outcome of this original study was, wow, ACEs are far more common than we thought. And more people have 4 or more ACEs than we ever imagined. 4 or more are what put you at much higher risk for poor mental and physical health into adulthood. In addition, when we look at Maine's youth coming out of the most recent MIAS data in 2023, 1 in 4 or 27% of Maine high school students have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So we consider that really high risk. When they have 4 or more ACEs, they're at much higher risk for, as I mentioned, into adulthood, having these poor health outcomes. And we'll look at that a little bit more. But of course, just really understanding the impact of it, why it's important when youth or any individual for that matter, right, is in this kind of heightened stress response, this what we consider toxic stress, experiencing traumatic events. Their physical, their nervous system is impacted in a variety of ways, as well as their limbic system, their brain, and the parts of their brain that really affect their ability to concentrate, their memory, their mood, self-regulation, and a variety of other things. So when we look at what the research really highlighted was when you have ACEs, you are then more at risk for a variety of negative health outcomes. You're more likely to engage in behaviors like smoking, alcohol, drug use, and you have a decrease in, life outcomes like graduation rates and academic achievement. It's also in a dose-dependent way. The more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have these negative outcomes. And in Maine specific, when we look at, this is from the 2019 data, they did not create anything for the 2023 data, but we're hoping to get something more recent soon. But in general, right, the takeaway is that the more ACEs a youth has or an individual has, the more likely they are to be struggling with depression, consider suicide, and, specific to our topic today, engage in drinking, use of marijuana, and cigarettes. So I lay that foundation to really just begin the conversation. But as I mentioned, today is a much more hopeful message in understanding while we can't prevent all the ACEs that these individuals are facing, there are in fact a lot of other things we can do that can both heal the impact of those ACEs and lead to pathways for, healthier outcomes, less substance use, and, better health into adulthood, both mental and physical. And so while ACEs are predictive of these negative health outcomes, there is much we can do to change the course of these individuals' lives. And it really is, right? We talked about the changes in the brain based on the adversity that one is facing. So if neurons, that fire together, wire together, that tells the story that we can in fact heal and create these healthier pathways in the brain, make neural connections that lead to more optimism, more better emotion regulation, right? And connection. And so in doing so, we can change the story for that individual despite having these ACEs and high risky behaviors and substance use. So, looking at this, while adversity can rewire the brain for that hypervigilance and stress, right? So someone who is experiencing adversity, all of those changes, both neurologically and in their nervous system, create kind of a brain that's hyperactive, hyper responsive to the different stressors in their life, affects their, ability to regulate. And so they're kind of walking around in this hypervigilant state. Even despite that, right, that positive experiences can do the opposite. So we can actually strengthen the neural pathways that promote well-being, learning, and resilience by being really intentional about the things we're going to talk about today that protect an individual. And so what we see when we start to get into the research around positive experiences, just in general, we know that positive experiences promote health and well-being. They allow an individual to have stronger relationships and connections, cultivate positive self-image and self-worth, provide a sense of belonging, and build skills that promote resilience. And as we get into some of these strategies, the science around how and why these different positive outcomes are possible, right? We often talk a lot about, for example, if we're talking about the stress response, we think of cortisol, right? We focus less and understand less on when somebody's having a positive experience, right? What is happening in their nervous system? What is happening in their brain? What are the hormones that are, part of that? And what are they doing? Why are they going to help benefit us? So really focusing on us understanding that just as much as we understand what's happening when we're experiencing adversity is important, because those are the intentional experiences we can cultivate, right? To activate, certain positive hormones being released, positive emotions, and what those then do in terms of an individual's ability to be creative, access memory, connect with one another, and create that pathway to adult positive outcomes. So much like there was the study of adverse childhood experiences in 1998, only recently, data from 2015, but published in 2019, was the first study on positive childhood experiences. And this research looked at adults and had them reflect on positive childhood experiences. And then, same as the ACEs study, correlated it with adult mental health. This original study did not include physical health, but many studies have followed up since have included physical health as well. And so when we're thinking about what kinds of positive childhood experiences we should be kind of thinking about. And what the study was really trying to capture is really, the safe and stable, nurturing relationships, at least one caring adult, feeling, heard and valued, supportive school and community environments, opportunities for play, creativity, exploration, having that kind of emotion regulation and emotional intelligence, right? And then, having that positive reinforcement as part of their experience. And you can see within all of these, right? Some of these may be coming from home, some are in the community, some are, other adults in their life, which we know is really important, having an adult outside of your parent. Maybe it's a neighbor or a teacher or a coach, helping them feel that sense of belonging. So we can see it's both relational, but it's also having intentional environments that allow for that, right? The safety, stability, opportunities for play, creativity, exploration. And then thinking about how they're kind of engaging with one another in that process, and the kind of self emotional development that when we create these safe spaces and these nurturing environments, we can interact in ways that help develop that emotional intelligence and emotion regulation that's possible for them to eventually navigate through difficulties in a resilient way. So, oh, my apologies, you can't see that percentage there, but it's 87%. So when we think about what came from that original study that was published in 2019, and so what they found was similar to the ACEs study, the more positive childhood experiences one has, the more likely they are to have positive adult mental health. So that's 87% good mental health in adulthood if you have 6 to 7 PCEs. What was most exciting about the research was when they looked at the intersection of ACEs and PCEs, even when an adult had 4 or more ACEs in their childhood, if they had 6 to 7 positive childhood experiences, they still had a 79% chance of good mental health in adulthood. So it only went down from 87% to 79%, despite having 4 or more ACEs, which was really exciting, astonishing, right? That positive childhood experiences buffer the impact, the negative health impact that we predict are going to happen when we have 4 or more ACEs. In addition to that, right, you can see in this chart, if you're just look at the yellow line on the top, if we start on the left side, that's an individual with, right, 4 to 8 ACE scores. So 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 ACEs in their life, almost 60% chance of poor mental health, depression or poor mental health. But as we look at having more positive childhood experiences, that number drops significantly to 20%, 21%. And if there's only really a 10-point difference between somebody who had no ACEs and high PCEs and someone who had 4 to 8 ACEs and high PCEs. So again, the significant role that PCEs play in an individual's health and well-being, right? And that even somebody, if you see the orange line, do you see if they have 1 ACE and no PCEs, they're at 45.7% likelihood of poor mental health. And so that means that in a way, right, a lot of the research says that actually having no PCEs may be more detrimental to your health than having ACEs, right? Because the impact of ACEs is so dramatic, even just one But once you have these positive childhood experiences, you are protected in many ways. And so, that is, as we know, when we're thinking about, specific to substance use, right? And whether or not youth are going to engage in risky behaviors, everything we know about these protective factors, when we look at the research and the data, is that when youth feel connected, when they have, that sense of belonging, when they have adults who are showing up for them, their use of substances decreases. And so that is very much connected to, right, these positive childhood experiences and being really intentional in how we're showing up for youth. And so when we think about resilience, right, when we think about wanting to protect and support and create that pathway to thriving, ultimately we need to think about, right, what do we need to do as adults to show up as a parent, as a clinician, as an educator, as a physician. How are we showing up? And ultimately that's what's going to lead to resilience, right? Resilience is about us infusing a variety of things, protective factors, nutrients into the soil so that the youth can thrive. And so at Maine Youth Thriving, we like to focus on kind of these three facets of fostering positive relationships, creating enriching environments, and supporting positive experiences. And we know that across the lifespan, right, this is important, right? If I'm not, as as a human being in my 40s, fostering positive relationships, creating enriching environments, and supporting positive experiences, both for myself and for my family, it's going to be really hard to thrive, right, as an individual and as a community or a family. And so thinking about all of those factors, all the people who are involved, right, that when we see youth, again, we want to think about all those people, the community in which they live, the family in which they grow up in, the school that they attend, and the variety of adults in there, the pediatric office that they visit, the clinician that they see, right? That all of these touch points start with human connection, human interaction, and human intention, right? How are we being intentional about creating these positive experiences that the research say, right, will help create that path to thriving despite the challenges that they may have faced in adversity or, right, their current struggle with substance use, depression, anxiety, things like that. So when we think about what it means to foster these bonds within a family, within, any, as we mentioned, it could be a classroom, it could be any environment, really, as an adult showing up, as a caring adult, how do we show up in a way that is going to help cultivate these positive experiences for you? And of course, we can look at that list and maybe try to think about it. Okay, let's make a checklist and try to make sure we're checking off as many of those as possible. But as you'll see from the list, right, it's not a one and done situation. This is a practice. This is showing up to each moment with intention, and that requires us to really think about, right, how are we showing up to the moment? How can we help to work with families, other, educators, any caring adult, right, who is working with youth? How can we help to facilitate this path to thriving? And so for some strategies today, we're going to look at it in terms of regulate, relate, and reframe. And of course, there are hundreds of ways in which we could think about these particular kind of strategies or frameworks that would be beneficial when we're thinking about, relationships, environments, and experiences. And while we only have an hour together today, right, I am happy to continue this conversation, or, answer questions and think about it in other ways at the end. I'm just going to stop for 1 second. I'm going to answer this question. How does this correlate with the benevolent child screening? Right. So there's the PCE screening, and then there's the benevolent child screening. Those are the two most popular. And so that list of things that I showed you are kind of a summary or a compilation of those points that are within those surveys. I didn't show you the actual survey. So the benevolent child, I believe, is 10 questions, and the PCE scale that was used in that original PCE study was 7 questions. But in general, they mirror each other. It's just the wording of the questions are slightly different. And so I tried to kind of highlight the topics, right, that are considered in the research to be what are considered positive childhood experiences. There is no cost to this access to the screenings and the question. And it's really because the scoring is so easy. It's like, if you have 3 of these and you didn't have the other 7, then you have a score of 3, right? So that's kind of how that works. But good question. Thank you. And I'm happy to share and follow up if you aren't able to find those surveys. But you should be able to just look them up. Okay. All right, so we'll get into some of these strategies, and then again, look forward to any thoughts or questions you have at the end. So if we're showing up as the adults and we're dysregulated, right, there's really no way that we're going to be able to show up for not just the youth, but really the other person in a way that's helpful, beneficial. We know that much like the kind of cliche of, put your own oxygen mask first, that we truly do need to meet our needs in order to meet the needs of others, to show up in a way that's going to serve them, especially if that individual is really struggling, right? Struggling with something that they need support in from us as individuals. So just thinking about this is really, the reminder of what do you do to take care of yourself, and not in that kind of cliche self-care kind of way, but really, really what are those ways that you can integrate some simple strategies into your daily life? Is it you take 3 deep breaths before you walk through the door, or however many times, if you're working in a medical office, you're putting on hand sanitizer constantly, right? Is there a way that you can integrate that with maybe just a brief mindful moment where you're just settling? So we're going to talk about a couple, easy strategies, but in general, this is really about taking that moment to pause and even just ask yourself, what do I need right now? You may find you need a sip of water, right? And so instead of walking through that door and, working with a client or a patient or, a student in the classroom, you are going and taking a sip of water, meeting a need that you could have gone maybe another hour or 2 without doing, that you really needed. And that's a small example. You can imagine, though, how that can compound over time, right? Of walking through your day and never meeting these little needs that you have, and being completely depleted at the end of the day, right? So how can we're talking about intention today. How can you be intentional, not just in what you're doing in your work and serving others, and but also with yourself, and how you can meet these needs that you have for yourself. right? It is very much about this stress response and how, we can think about ways to take care of that. Why? Because if we're showing up, right, in this stressed way, guess what? Um, you know, our brains mirror other brains. And so when they're observing, say you're, with an individual and you're feeling distress, their brain's going to pick up on that. And the same is true for the opposite. If you are regulated and your brain is your neurons are kind of firing in that way, then the neurons in the other individual are going to pick up on that and want to mirror it. So how can we show up in the most present, regulated way so that that connection, that interaction, that experience can be as positive as possible? And that really requires us as the starting point, right, for everything else, kind of like that domino effect, right, to move forward in that resilient path forward. So we all have a vagus nerve. This is the largest nerve in our parasympathetic. Sorry that when I convert from PowerPoint to Canva, sometimes things get cut off, so I apologize. But this is the largest cranial nerve. It's part of our parasympathetic nervous system. And as many of you know who are familiar with the vagus nerve, there's something called vagal tone. So we can activate our vagus nerve to send the rest and digest part of our nervous system a signal that then sends a signal to our brain that says, okay, we can move into that relaxed state. The more we do that, the more regularly we activate our vagus nerve, we can increase our vagal tone. People with a higher vagal tone have a less reactive amygdala in their brain, that stress response alarm system. So we have this incredible tool in our body that, when practiced and activated regularly, provides a mechanism for us to have more control over our stress response, which is a very automatic thing. It's not something we're ever going to be able to stop, but we can regulate it in different ways and create a nervous system that's going to be less activated on a moment to moment basis, and in stressful response be able to navigate that challenge or that stressful event again with more regulation and less activation of that stress response. So if we think back to when we were talking about adversity, right, that the way in which the amygdala fires, our nervous system is on high alert. When we're in that state regularly over time, that's the toxic stress that we're talking about. That's what then leads to these negative health outcomes. So by interrupting that cycle, right, by being in that stressful state, but being able to then tell the nervous system, I'm safe, I can go back to my rest and digest place. We're preventing that chronic toxic stress state over time. And so these are just some ways in which you can begin to think about activating your vagus nerve. And, breath is really the best tool we have in terms of its effectiveness. And we have our breath is with us wherever we go. It doesn't require anything extra. And it is really something that we can utilize as a tool. So we hear a lot about this. I do this for a living, right? And I can often at the end of the week think back and say, oh man, why didn't I take, this was a stressful week. I should have been more intentional about, pausing before hopping into a meeting and just taking some deep breaths. Because what I know is when I do that at the end of the week, I don't have the same exhaustion, fatigue, irritability, right? That can happen when you're not taking the intentional time. Little moments. We're just talking about little moments, but they require intention. Box breathing is an excellent strategy. It resets your nervous system, really brings you very quickly into, by your 4 cycles, your nervous system is in that rest and digest. It's a good one to use with youth as well, because there's kind of that visual component that helps. 4-7-8 breathing. This one is really good for, anxiety, panic attack. If you're somebody who has trouble falling asleep at night, I know I just start ruminating. This one almost creates that meditative, relaxed physical body because of the way you're using breath and oxygen. And so that's a great strategy as well. And then the simple sigh. It's amazing how our body has this as a natural kind of reset to our nervous system. I know I'll be like puttering in my kitchen and my husband will turn to me and say, like, what's going on? What are you feeling stressed about? And I kind of look at him like, what do you mean? And he says, well, you just sighed twice. So you may find that you kind of do a natural sigh, and that is a signal to you that your body is dysregulated and needs some care and attention in terms of moving you out of the stress response and into a more relaxed rest and digest space. And we're going to get into this name it to tame it more in the next section as well. But when we think about regulating our nervous system, so this comes from the work of Dan Siegel, and he, talks about if this is our brain, and this is really the oldest part of our brain that's responsible for our rest and digest, and this is really all the other parts of the brain, but mostly that prefrontal cortex that kind of comes up and over, that's responsible for, our rational thinking and reasoning brain. You can see if you are in a stress state, your brain is almost walking around like this, that you're not able to access your thinking, reasoning, problem solving, planning. And this part of your brain is in hyper, kind of in control. It's like driving the boat. And when we can name the feelings that we're having, because in order to name an emotion, we have to bring in our thinking and reasoning brain, we automatically, instantaneously kind of bring this part of our brain back online. And by doing so, calms down our amygdala and sends a signal that we can move out of that fight, flight, or freeze. So my apologies if that's repetitive for anyone who knows of Dan Siegel's work, but it is incredibly simple, and yet something we don't often just pause and take a moment to try to name how we're feeling. In doing so, we completely change how we're moving through that moment and what we have access to in our brain, right? So, in our most stressful times, I think our thinking, rational, and problem-solving brain would be really helpful, right? And so bringing it back online, giving us access to that. So we're kind of showing up now in a more regulated way, right? We can take some time to pause, regulate ourselves. And now the next piece is how we relate to others, right? So in all of the work that you all do, right, it's often very much about trying to solve problems, right? And trying to support and help around a problem. And so how do we show up to those moments now that we're regulated in a way that also kind of validates and connects people, because we know once somebody is regulated and once they're in connection with others, they only then have full capacity to do all the other things that we would like an individual to be able to do, to work through a problem, to think about, reframing how they're thinking about it, to, problem solve, to engage in ways that are going to be uh, effective, right? In terms of strategies and techniques and all of that. So just thinking about, okay, now we're regulated and we're kind of thinking about the different emotions. How do we relate to one another in this time? What are the emotions, and how can, if you're working with youth, right, how can you help them identify what kind of emotions are at play? So again, not only are you doing this to regulate yourself, right? As the adult, how can you help, the youth in your lives engage in that same strategy? And it's helpful to, not tell them how they feel, right? But help give prompts that may help them explore different emotions. And over time, they'll have more language to be able to do it themselves. And you can move away from, um, giving them those words to kind of asking curious questions about, how they're feeling, allowing them to identify it. Of course, we want to stay away from it. I'm a mom of 4 and work with youth, and even though I know better, right, it is a natural tendency to want to make them feel better when you see them struggling, suffering. And this could be for your best friend, your partner, right? And especially, right, with those youth in your lives that you either work with or live with, to reassure them, to take away the struggle and the difficult emotion that they're in, because you want them to, it's all good intention, right? Because you want them to feel better. But what this does is it does a few things. It removes the ability for them to explore their emotions so that they get more comfortable with the emotion. When we don't, we think about the work of Dr. Susan David out of Harvard University. She talks about emotional agility. And what makes us get stuck in a difficult emotion is our inability to sit with it and we try to move through it too quickly, right? We either avoid it, numb it, distract ourselves from it, and that's when it gets stuck. So even though, right, we're trying to be helpful, when we use phrases like this, we often send the message that that difficult emotion is something we need to suppress, avoid, and by doing so, right, kind of teach it to get stuck. And so helping, youth process, there's a strategy called love listening, LUV, listen, understand, validate. And so this is really your kind of showing up to that moment to listen without interrupting. You're going to kind of repeat back to them and show that you understand, and then validating their feelings. Again, probably something we do some of naturally, depending on the moment, depending on if we're regulated or not, depending on a lot of different factors. But again, love listening, LUV, it's about showing up to these moments intentionally, right? Saying, I'm going to use this strategy in this moment. And so if we kind of look at the different components, it's, again, none of this is really rocket science. It's just slowing down, and showing up in a very, intentional, specific way. So, really paying attention, not focusing on what you're going to say next, but really listening with the desire that you want them to know you're trying to understand their feelings. You're really showing up, right, with that kind of intent to listen. And you want to understand them. You're kind of asking questions. You're repeating back these main points for clarity. You're really seeking to understand. And then validating, right? Really expressing empathy. Even if you don't agree with what that person is sharing or experiencing, but really kind of expressing that empathy, and then also not showing up to provide the solutions for them, but expressing your confidence, your support in them, right? Figuring out what might be the best solution moving forward. And so it is very much about curiosity, right? It's about patience, and this from a mentor of mine, just checking with yourself. I'm listening, but am I listening to fix? Am I listening to win? Or am I listening to learn? And we always want to be showing up listening to learn, right? Because we're there to support and to facilitate, but that individual is their own human being on their own path who has their own experience. And so if we're listening to fix or listening to win, we're putting a wall between us and them. We're not truly, giving them the support that they ultimately came to us for. And then finally, reframing. There's lots of, techniques. I'm sure there's clinicians on the call today who have lots of strategies for reframing. But really just thinking about, what are you hearing when you're listening? And in that, are there some maybe some ants that you're noticing, these kind of all or nothing thinking, these, this negative mind chatter. Anytime we're hearing that, again, we want to validate that's their experience and then offer some other ways of thinking, listening for a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. So are they speaking in a way that is, I'm never going to be able to do this, something that is very fixed, that meaning their brain can't, adjust, learn, practice something to improve, or we want to move them right into that growth mindset, that more malleable thinking that our brains can learn and grow, and that when things are hard, it's actually a good thing, right? It means our brains are working hard to get there and to learn. And self-compassion. So I grew up in the self-esteem era, which we're now kind of moving away from, right? Because we know that in those times of struggle, self-compassion is actually much more beneficial and helpful. And it really is about teaching all of us, really. I mean, we all could use more self-compassion. We're ultimately the harshest critics on ourselves, right? So really thinking about, how do I show up for myself in this moment the way I would my best friend? How can I show myself compassion, show myself kindness over judgment, right? What does that sound like? How can I be more gentle? Would I say these things to my best friend? The common humanity, right? When we struggle, we self-isolate. It's just a natural thing that we do. And by doing so, we're actually perpetuating that struggle and that loneliness, and that we're the only ones, right, experiencing that in that moment in time. So how do we bring in the common humanity and the mindfulness piece, that, some separation between our emotions and the reality, that I'm not angry, I'm just feeling angry in this moment, right? So again, just kind of some mindful separation there. I'm just keeping it keeping a look on the time. And so I'm just gonna kind of close out. So we talked about regulating, reframing. Why am I forgetting the middle one? Sorry. I'm all caught up in my head right now. But thinking about these different ways in which we can regulate, relate, and reframe, and just end with just a moment of reflection for you all. Just thinking about maybe what struck you today, what felt like it matters most to the work that you do, whether it was just the piece about, self-regulation for yourself, or maybe just the lens of reminding yourself of the impact that you truly are having with every interaction that you're showing up, whether it feels like it in the moment or not. You're an adult that's showing up for youth, and that is a positive experience that is ultimately changing, their brain and who they're going to end up being because of the interactions that you're having and the support you're showing. Or maybe it was one of the other strategies we talked about today, but I hope your kind of wheels are turning and maybe thinking a little bit differently, or at least feeling validated and hopeful about the work that you're already doing, which I will end by expressing gratitude for you all for the work that you do, and showing up for those that you work with. That's all I have for you today. We have some time for questions, so happy to answer any questions. And I have a QR code if you're able to fill out a little brief evaluation.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Lorraine, can others relate to the feeling as though when we get to the reframe, it becomes a clumsy process? Oh.
No, I feel you. I feel you. I relate. I don't know about anybody else, and I'll let others chime in if they feel like it. Yeah, we can often maybe try to find the words, or what should I say, or am I, I would say if you've made it that far, then it's a win all around, regardless of whether or not you feel like you said the right thing or reframed it for them. I think just being in connection and feeling supported, that ultimately, they have what they need and they're going to get to that place. So I would say give yourself some compassion, some self-compassion around that. And maybe just pick one or two, or one for the week, and just really focus on one, rather than thinking about all the ways you could use different reframes and approaching every situation with all those choices. I don't know, or have your favorite, maybe something like that. But
Thank you so much. And Lorraine says thank you too. I often think I move too fast. These are good suggestions. Any other questions can be placed in chat. Cheryl says thank you for the wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Miremadi-Baldino, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, and I'll give you 4 minutes back in your lunch hour, and we hope to see you again soon.
thank you. Take care, everyone.